The strange thing about secrets is that you never realize someone has noticed them until the moment they start looking at you differently. I first noticed Adrian Cole on a Tuesday morning in late October, 3 months after he transferred into our department at Mercer Media in downtown Seattle. He sat across from me in a glass-walled office that overlooked 4th Avenue, surrounded by spreadsheets and dual monitors, speaking only when absolutely necessary. In a company filled with loud creative directors and salespeople who treated every meeting like a performance, Adrian seemed completely out of place. He arrived at exactly 8 o'clock every morning, drank black coffee from the same dark blue mug, and somehow managed to disappear into the background despite being 6 feet tall and impossible to ignore once you actually looked at him. The rest of the team called him mysterious. I just thought he was quiet. At least, that was what I told myself. By then, I had worked at Mercer for almost 4 years as a graphic designer. My coworkers knew me as the easygoing guy who volunteered to stay late before deadlines and remembered everyone's birthday. They knew I liked old movies, hated office small talk, and ordered the same turkey sandwich every Thursday from the deli downstairs. What they did not know was that every carefully chosen detail about my life existed to distract them from the parts one kept hidden. It had become second nature years earlier. Smile at the right moments. Laugh at harmless jokes. Deflect personal questions with stories that revealed nothing important. Most days, I did not even think about it anymore. Keeping secrets is exhausting at first, but eventually it becomes routine, like taking the same route to work every morning. The office occupied the 23rd floor of a steel and glass building, and from my desk, I could see ferries crossing Elliott Bay whenever the weather cooperated. Seattle in November meant endless gray skies and rain tapping against the windows for days at a time. Most evenings, people rushed out the moment the clock hit 5:30, eager to escape traffic and get home. I usually stayed. Officially, it was because our department was preparing for a major campaign launch. Unofficially, empty offices felt safer than crowded bars or awkward conversations about relationships I had no interest in having. Adrian stayed late too. That was the first thing we had in common. Some nights, after everyone else left, I would hear the soft clicking of his keyboard from the other side of the room while I adjusted colors on advertising mock-ups for clients who sold things nobody actually needed. We rarely spoke beyond polite greetings. Yet I started noticing small details about him against my better judgment. The way he rolled up his sleeves when concentrating. The fact that he always listened to instrumental music while working. The strange habit he had of staring out at the city lights whenever he thought nobody was paying attention. One Thursday evening, I walked into the break room just after 9 and found him standing beside the coffee machine, reading something on his phone. He looked up as I entered, almost startled. "You are still here?" I asked, opening the refrigerator. He slipped his phone into his pocket. "You could ask yourself the same question." I laughed quietly. "Deadlines." He nodded as though that explained everything. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Rain streaked the windows behind him, turning the city into a blur of lights and reflections. Then, just as I grabbed my dinner from the refrigerator, Adrian said something unexpected. "You do not seem like someone who likes being alone." The comment caught me off guard. I looked at him, genuinely unsure how to respond. We had exchanged maybe 20 conversations since he arrived, and suddenly he was making observations about my life. "That is oddly specific," I said. Adrian shrugged and took a sip of coffee. "I pay attention." He said it casually, but the words stayed with me long after I returned to my desk. Over the following weeks, I started catching him looking at me through the glass walls of the office. Never long enough to feel intrusive. Just brief glances during meetings or quiet moments between projects. Maybe anyone else would have ignored it. Maybe anyone else would have assumed it meant nothing. But there was something about Adrian's expression that unsettled me. It was not curiosity exactly. It felt more like recognition, as though he had noticed something I had spent years making sure nobody could see. And for the first time since joining Mercer Media, I found myself wondering whether the quiet man sitting across from me knew far more about me than he was willing to admit. After that conversation in the break room, I told myself I was imagining things. Adrian had simply made an observation, nothing more. People notice strange details about each other all the time, especially in an office where everyone spent 40 hours a week pretending to care about marketing campaigns and quarterly reports. Still, over the next few days, I became painfully aware of his presence. On Monday morning, I arrived 10 minutes early and found him already at his desk, typing quietly as pale sunlight filtered through the windows. He glanced up when I walked in and offered a small nod before returning to his work. It should have been an ordinary moment, but somehow it felt different. For the rest of the day, I caught myself looking toward his office more often than usual. He remained exactly the same as always. Focused, reserved, impossible to read. Yet something had shifted, and I could not decide whether it was him or me. The truth was that I had spent most of my adult life making sure nobody looked too closely. Growing up in Spokane, I learned early that some things were easier to leave unsaid. My parents were kind people, but conversations about relationships always carried unspoken expectations. By college, I had become an expert at changing the subject whenever friends asked whether I was dating anyone. I built an entire version of myself that fit comfortably into other people's assumptions. By 27, the act had become effortless, or at least I thought it had. Wednesday evening brought another round of overtime as our team raced to finish presentations for a sportswear client. By 8 o'clock, only a handful of people remained. The creative director paced between offices with a tablet in his hand, while someone in accounting reheated leftovers in the kitchen. Around 9, the floor finally emptied until only Adrian and I remained. I sat hunched over my computer, adjusting typography for the 100th time, when my phone buzzed against the desk. The screen lit up with my younger sister, Emma's name. I hesitated before answering and stepped into the hallway outside the office. "Hey," I said quietly. Emma immediately launched into a story about Thanksgiving plans and our parents arguing over who would host dinner this year. I smiled despite myself and leaned against the window overlooking the city. Then, after a pause, her voice softened. "Mom asked whether you were bringing someone this year." I closed my eyes. "And what did you tell her?" "The usual," Emma replied. "That you are busy and impossible to pin down." I laughed under my breath, though the sound felt hollow. Emma had known the truth about me for years. She was one of the few people who did. "You know," she said carefully, "you do not have to keep doing this forever." I stared down at the headlights moving through the rain below. Doing what? Pretending that being alone is easier. Before I could answer, someone pushed open the glass door at the end of the hallway. I turned instinctively and saw Adrian step out carrying his coffee mug. He froze when he noticed me standing there. I immediately lowered my voice. "I should go," I told Emma. "Call me this weekend." We hung up, and for a brief second, neither Adrian nor I moved. "Sorry," he said. "I did not realize you were on the phone." "It is fine." He nodded, but instead of walking away, he leaned against the opposite wall and looked out at the city. The silence stretched awkwardly between us. Then he spoke without looking in my direction. "Family." I slipped my phone into my pocket. "My sister." Adrian smiled faintly. "You sounded different." I frowned. "Different how?" He thought for a moment. "Lighter." The answer caught me off guard. Nobody had ever described me that way before. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words never came. Adrian glanced at me then, his expression unreadable beneath the fluorescent lights. "You hide a lot of things, Mason," he said quietly. My stomach tightened. Before I could ask what he meant, he pushed himself away from the wall and headed back toward his office. I stood there alone, watching him disappear behind the glass doors, unable to shake the feeling that somehow, without either of us saying it out loud, he had started seeing pieces of me that I had spent years trying to keep invisible. The next week passed in a blur of client meetings and endless revisions, but Adrian's words stayed with me in ways I could not explain. "You hide a lot of things, Mason." He had said it so casually, almost like an observation about the weather, yet every time I looked across the office and saw him sitting behind his monitors, I wondered what exactly he thought he knew. The strange part was that he never brought it up again. He did not ask personal questions or linger by my desk. If anything, he became even quieter. That should have reassured me. Instead, it only made me more uneasy. Thanksgiving was 2 days away, and Mercer Media had already begun to empty out for the holiday weekend. Half the staff had taken time off, leaving the office unusually silent. Outside, Seattle was wrapped in cold rain and early darkness, the kind that arrived before 5 o'clock and stayed until morning. By Wednesday evening, only Adrian and I remained on the 23rd floor. He sat in his office reviewing data projections while I struggled to finish the final graphics package for our sportswear campaign. Around 8:30, my computer froze for the third time that night. and I let out a frustrated sigh loud enough for him to hear through the glass wall between us. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps approaching my desk. "Everything okay?" Adrian asked, holding his coffee mug with both hands. "My software hates me," I muttered. He leaned slightly closer to examine my screen. "Have you tried restarting it?" I laughed despite myself. That advice sounds suspiciously like something my father would say. Adrian smiled faintly. "Does it work?" "Unfortunately, yes." He nodded and turned to leave, but before he could walk away, my phone vibrated against the desk. Without thinking, I reached for it. The moment I saw the notification, my expression changed. It was a message from Daniel. I locked the screen immediately, but not before noticing Adrian glance toward me. "Bad news?" he asked. "No, just someone from college." It was a lie, and not even a convincing one. Daniel had not been part of my life for nearly a year, but his messages still had the power to unravel me. We had met shortly after I moved to Seattle, and for almost 8 months, he had been the closest thing I had ever had to a real relationship. At least until he decided he was tired of being someone's secret. He was not cruel when he left. That was what made it worse. One night, sitting across from me in a quiet restaurant, he simply admitted that he wanted a life I was not ready to have. He wanted introductions and holidays and photographs that did not need to stay hidden on his phone. I had nodded and pretended to understand, even though part of me had known he was right. Since then, we rarely spoke. Yet every few months, one of us would send a message that reopened wounds neither of us had fully healed. Adrian studied me for a second longer than felt comfortable. "You do not have to tell me," he said quietly. "I know." He hesitated, then added, "You just look like someone remembering something painful." I forced a smile and turned back to my computer. "You always notice things like that?" "Only when people think nobody is paying attention." The room fell silent again. A few minutes later, Adrian returned to his office, and I tried to focus on work, but the message on my phone kept pulling at my thoughts. Eventually, I gave up and stepped outside onto the small, covered balcony connected to the break room. The rain had stopped, leaving the city glowing beneath low clouds. I pulled my jacket tighter and unlocked my phone. Daniel's message was simple. "I saw your company won the Henderson account. Congratulations. Hope you are doing okay." That was all. No hidden meaning. No dramatic confession. Just a reminder of someone I had once cared about and the version of myself I had never been brave enough to become. I stared at the screen for several minutes before slipping the phone back into my pocket. "Seattle looks different from up here at night." Adrian's voice startled me. I turned and found him standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets. "You have a habit of appearing out of nowhere," I said. "Occupational hazard." He stepped onto the balcony but kept a respectful distance. Together, we watched the city lights flicker against the wet streets below. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then Adrian glanced toward me and asked, almost casually, "Have you ever felt like you built your whole life around protecting one secret?" My heart stopped. I looked at him, searching his face for some sign that he knew exactly what he was asking. But his expression remained calm, unreadable, as if he had simply voiced a passing thought. For the second time in as many weeks, I found myself unable to answer. For the rest of Thanksgiving weekend, I could not stop thinking about what Adrian had asked me on the balcony. "Have you ever felt like you built your whole life around protecting one secret?" The question followed me all the way back to Spokane, where my parents' house looked exactly as it always had. The same maple tree stood in the front yard. The same framed family photographs lined the hallway. Even the smell of cinnamon candles and my mother's cooking seemed untouched by time. Yet somewhere between college and my 27th birthday, I had started feeling like a visitor in my own life. Dinner that Thursday was loud and familiar. My father complained about football scores while Emma teased me for arriving 30 minutes late. At one point, my mother casually asked whether anyone special was keeping me in Seattle for Christmas. I gave the same answer I had given for years. "Work is busy. Maybe next year." Nobody pressed the subject, but Emma caught my eye from across the table, and I knew exactly what she was thinking. On Sunday evening, I drove back to Seattle beneath a gray sky, arriving just as rain began to fall again. By Monday morning, Mercer Media was alive with holiday decorations and year-end deadlines. I expected things with Adrian to return to normal after the long weekend. Instead, they became even stranger. He seemed to sense when I was overwhelmed before I said anything. He appeared beside my desk with coffee. During difficult meetings, He somehow noticed when I skipped lunch or stayed too late. None of it crossed any professional boundaries, but every small gesture made me more aware of him. More importantly, it made me wonder why he cared at all. 2 weeks later, our department was thrown into chaos when the Henderson account, the biggest campaign of the year, suddenly ran into serious problems. The client wanted major revisions before a presentation in Portland, and senior management decided to send a small team to handle the situation in person. Late Thursday afternoon, our creative director called me into a conference room. "Pack for 3 days," she said, sliding a folder across the table. "You and Adrian leave tomorrow morning." I blinked. "Just the two of us?" She nodded. "You know the creative side. He knows the analytics. Figure it out." By 6 o'clock the next morning, Adrian and I were driving south on Interstate 5 in a company rental car, while Seattle disappeared behind us in a curtain of rain. The first hour passed mostly in silence. Adrian focused on the road while I pretended to review presentation notes that I had already memorized. Eventually, somewhere near Tacoma, he reached over and lowered the volume of the radio. "You looked miserable when Karen announced this trip," he said. I stared out the window. "I just do not love unexpected travel." "That is not the impression I got." I glanced toward him. "And what impression did you get?" He smiled without taking his eyes off the highway. "That spending 3 days alone with me sounded exhausting." Heat rushed into my face, which only made his smile widen slightly. "You really do pay attention to everything." "Occupational hazard," he replied, repeating the same answer he had given weeks earlier. Portland greeted us with freezing rain and crowded streets decorated for the holidays. We checked into a hotel near the river and spent the afternoon in conference rooms discussing marketing projections and redesigns. By evening, both of us were exhausted. The client dinner had been canceled at the last minute, leaving us unexpectedly free. Adrian suggested finding someplace nearby to eat in 20 minutes. Later, we ended up in a small restaurant overlooking the waterfront. The atmosphere was warm and quiet, filled with soft music and the sound of rain against the windows. For the first time since we had started working together, there were no deadlines or coworkers around us. Just the two of us sitting across from each other. Somewhere between discussing work and arguing about whether Seattle or Portland had better coffee, my phone buzzed on the table. I looked down and immediately felt my stomach tighten. It was another message from Daniel. I locked the screen so quickly that I almost knocked over my glass. Adrian noticed. Of course he noticed. He set down his fork and studied me for a moment. "The same person from the office?" he asked quietly. I forced a smile that convinced neither of us. "Something like that." Adrian nodded. But this time, instead of changing the subject, he held my gaze for a few seconds longer than usual. Then he leaned back in his chair and said something that made my heart skip. "You know, Mason, I think you spend so much energy hiding parts of yourself that you forget not everyone is looking for a reason to walk away." For a moment, I forgot about the restaurant around us. The sound of dishes clinking against tables faded into the background, and all I could focus on was Adrian sitting across from me, watching with that same calm expression he always wore. Most people filled silence because they were uncomfortable with it. Adrian seemed to understand silence in a way that made it impossible to hide inside it. I looked down at my untouched drink and forced out a laugh that sounded hollow even to me. "You make it sound like I am hiding from the government." Adrian smiled faintly. "No, just from yourself." I should have changed the subject. I should have laughed it off the way I always did whenever conversations drifted too close to anything real. Instead, I stared out the rain-covered window beside our table and asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind for weeks. "Why do you keep saying things like that?" Adrian rested his elbows against the table. "Because I notice patterns." "Patterns you never talk about." "Your personal life. You leave every office party early. You answer questions without actually answering them." He paused. "And every time someone gets too close, you pull away." His words landed harder than I expected because they were true. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but nothing came out. Adrian looked away for a moment, almost as if he regretted saying too much. "Forget it," he said quietly. "It is none of my business." But it already felt like his business. That was the problem. Somewhere between late nights at the office and conversations in empty hallways, Adrian had become the first person in years who made me feel seen. Not understood exactly. That would have been easier. This was something else. We finished dinner and walked back to the hotel beneath a sea of umbrellas and holiday lights. Portland was colder than Seattle that night, and the wind coming off the river cut through my jacket. Adrian walked beside me with his hands in his pockets, neither of us saying much. When we reached the hotel lobby, he stopped near the elevators. "Big presentation tomorrow," he said. "Try to get some sleep." I nodded. "You too." The elevator doors opened, and for a second, I thought he was going to say something else. Instead, he simply offered a small smile and disappeared down the hallway toward his room. I spent most of the night awake. Around midnight, I gave up pretending to sleep and sat by the window, watching headlights move through the wet streets below. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Daniel. I almost ignored it, but curiosity won. "Are you ever going to stop pretending that being alone is what you want?" I stared at the screen for a long time. Daniel had asked me versions of that question for nearly a year. I never had an answer. The truth was that being alone had never been what I wanted. It was simply what felt safest. The next morning, our presentation went surprisingly well. By noon, the client had approved most of the revisions, and Karen called to congratulate us from Seattle. Adrian and I celebrated with coffee from a cafe near the hotel before heading back to pack. Everything should have felt normal. Instead, an invisible tension had settled between us after the conversation at dinner. Back in my room, I opened my suitcase and realized that my laptop charger was missing. After checking every drawer twice, I remembered leaving it in the conference room downstairs. I took the elevator back to the lobby and found the room empty except for Adrian, who sat alone at the far end of the table reviewing notes. He looked up when I entered. "Forgot something?" "My charger." I crossed the room and found it beside my chair. As I stuffed it into my bag, Adrian closed his laptop. "Can I ask you something?" he said. I hesitated. "Depends." He studied me for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Who is Daniel?" The question hit me like cold water. For a few seconds, I genuinely could not breathe. I replayed every conversation we had ever had, trying to understand how he knew the name. Adrian immediately seemed to realize what I was thinking. "Yesterday, when your phone lit up on the table, I saw it by accident." He leaned back in his chair. "You looked terrified every time he texted you." I tightened my grip on the charger. I was not terrified. Adrian nodded slowly, unconvinced. "Okay." The room fell silent. Outside the conference room windows, gray clouds drifted over the city skyline. I should have walked away. I should have ended the conversation and returned to the safety of polite distance. Instead, I sat down across from him and stared at the empty chair beside me. "He was someone important," I said quietly. Adrian did not interrupt. He simply waited. And for the first time in years, I found myself wondering what would happen if I finally stopped hiding. I do not know what made me stay in that conference room. Maybe it was exhaustion from months of pretending. Maybe it was the fact that Adrian had already seen too much for me to retreat behind another carefully rehearsed answer. Whatever the reason, I sat across from him and stared at the rain sliding down the windows while my heart pounded hard enough to make me dizzy. Adrian did not rush me. He closed his laptop, folded his hands on the table, and waited. "Daniel and I met 3 years ago," I finally said. My voice sounded strange in the empty room, quieter than usual. "We dated for almost 8 months. The words hung between us. Even after all these years, saying them out loud still felt unfamiliar. Adrian's expression did not change. He simply nodded, as though I had told him something ordinary. He was the first person I ever really let into my life. I continued. At least, as much as I knew how. I let out a small laugh that carried no humor. Turns out, that was not enough. Adrian leaned back slightly, but kept his eyes on me. "What happened?" I looked down at my hands. He got tired of being invisible. For a moment, I considered stopping there, but once the truth started coming out, it became impossible to force it back inside. I told Adrian about the quiet dinners where I avoided crowded places because I was afraid someone from work might see us. I told him about holidays spent making excuses and introducing Daniel as a friend whenever family came to visit Seattle. I admitted how every conversation about the future ended with me changing the subject because imagining an honest life felt impossible. He kept asking what I was afraid of, I said softly, and I never had a good answer. Adrian looked toward the city skyline beyond the glass. "Did you love him?" The question caught me off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because nobody had ever asked me that directly. I thought about it for several seconds before answering. I think I did. My throat tightened, but I was more afraid of losing everything else. Adrian nodded slowly, as though he understood something I had not yet figured out myself. And now, he asked. Now I live alone, work too much, and pretend that was always the plan. The corner of Adrian's mouth lifted into a sad smile. That sounds exhausting. I laughed quietly. It is. Silence settled between us again, though it felt different now. Lighter somehow. The room no longer seemed as cold as it had an hour earlier. For the first time since Adrian joined Mercer Media, I felt like he was not looking through me or studying me from a distance. He was simply there. After a moment, I glanced at him. You know, most people would have reacted differently. Differently how? Surprised. Uncomfortable. Curious. Adrian looked genuinely confused. Why would I be any of those things? I opened my mouth, then closed it again. The truth was that I did not know. Years of secrecy had trained me to expect disappointment from people before they even had the chance to disappoint me. Adrian rested his elbows on the table and looked down at his coffee cup. Mason, I need to tell you something. There was something in his voice that immediately made me sit up straighter. He hesitated for the first time since we had met, as if carefully choosing words he had been holding on to for a long time. I did not figure this out because I was trying to invade your privacy. He ran a hand through his hair and looked away. Honestly, I noticed because some of the things you do felt familiar. I frowned. Familiar? Adrian exhaled slowly. When I moved to Seattle 4 years ago, I spent a long time doing exactly what you are doing now. Keeping parts of my life separate. Measuring every conversation. Wondering how people would react if they knew everything. My mind struggled to catch up with what he was saying. Adrian met my eyes again, calm and steady. You are not the only person in this room who understands what it feels like to hide. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and weak winter sunlight broke through the clouds over Portland. I stared at him, replaying every late night at the office, every strange question, every moment I had caught him watching me through the glass walls. Suddenly, things that had seemed mysterious before began to make sense. You knew, I said quietly. Adrian smiled, though there was something vulnerable in his expression now. Not right away. He paused. But after a while, yes. I looked away, overwhelmed by the realization that the one person who had seen through my carefully constructed life was someone who understood it better than anyone else ever had. The drive back to Seattle should have felt awkward after that conversation, but somehow it did not. Adrian and I spent nearly 3 hours on Interstate 5 beneath gray skies and steady rain, talking about things that had nothing to do with secrets. We argued about which neighborhood had the best coffee shops, laughed about terrible movies we both secretly enjoyed, and complained about the endless construction downtown. Yet underneath every ordinary conversation, there was a quiet understanding between us that had not existed before Portland. For the first time since we met, I was no longer trying to guess who Adrian really was. And for the first time in years, I felt strangely relieved that someone finally knew the truth about me. Monday morning arrived too quickly. Mercer Media was decorated for the holidays, with wreaths hanging near the elevators and soft music drifting through the lobby. Everything looked exactly the same as it had before our trip, but something fundamental had shifted. I noticed Adrian's smile when he saw me walk into the office. I noticed how naturally we fell into conversation during meetings. Most of all, I noticed that I had stopped worrying about whether he was watching me. One evening, about a week later, we stayed late to finish revisions for another client presentation. By 8:30, everyone else had gone home, leaving only the familiar hum of computers and the city lights beyond the glass walls. I stood near the break room pouring coffee when Adrian walked in carrying a stack of reports. You know, I said, handing him a mug. I still cannot figure you out. He raised an eyebrow. That is disappointing. I thought Portland solved the mystery. Not even close. He laughed quietly and leaned against the counter. What exactly are you trying to figure out? I hesitated, unsure whether I should ask the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since our conversation in the conference room. Eventually, curiosity won. Why me? Adrian looked genuinely surprised. What do you mean? You said some of my habits seemed familiar. You noticed things nobody else noticed. But you started paying attention long before you knew anything for certain. He stared down into his coffee for a moment, considering his answer. Then he looked back at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not uncertainty exactly. It felt more like someone deciding whether to tell the truth. Do you remember my first week here? He asked. I shrugged. Barely. Adrian smiled. I remember it perfectly. He walked over to the window overlooking downtown Seattle and folded his arms. I had just moved apartments. I did not know anyone, and honestly, I was thinking about leaving the company altogether. That surprised me. Adrian had always seemed calm and confident, the kind of person who belonged anywhere. He shook his head as if reading my thoughts. You looked just as lost as I felt, even though everyone around you thought you had everything figured out. I frowned. I did not look lost. You did. He smiled softly. You stayed late every night, ate dinner alone at your desk, and smiled at people in a way that felt rehearsed. I opened my mouth to argue, then stopped because I knew he was right. Adrian continued, his voice quieter now. At first, I paid attention because I recognized something familiar. But after a while, it became something else. The room suddenly felt very small. Rain tapped gently against the windows while the coffee machine hummed behind us. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but my heart had already started racing. Something else? I asked. Adrian looked out over the city lights before answering. I started looking for reasons to talk to you. He laughed under his breath, almost embarrassed by the admission. I volunteered for projects I did not care about because I knew you would be there. I stayed late when I could have gone home. And every time you walked into a room, I found myself paying attention without meaning to. I stared at him, unsure whether I had heard him correctly. For weeks, I had convinced myself that Adrian's quiet observations came from curiosity or coincidence. The possibility that they came from something more had never seemed real enough to consider. He turned toward me again and shrugged, suddenly looking far less composed than usual. I know that probably sounds ridiculous. No, I said quietly. It does not. Adrian studied my face as though trying to determine what I was thinking. The truth was that I had no idea. All I knew was that somewhere, between late nights at Mercer Media and rainy conversations in Portland, the quiet coworker I had spent months trying to understand had somehow become the person I understood most. After Adrian's confession, neither of us moved for several seconds. The office around us remained exactly the same as it had always been. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, rain slid down the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a printer started running in another department. Yet everything felt different. I leaned against the counter and tried to process what he had just said. Part of me wanted to ask 100 questions. Another part wanted to retreat back into the safety of the life I had carefully built. Adrian seemed to sense the conflict on my face because he looked away first. You do not have to say anything, he said quietly. I know this is a lot. I laughed nervously. You have a talent for making ordinary conversations unexpectedly complicated. He smiled. I have been told that before. The truth was that complicated did not even begin to describe what I was feeling. For years, I had convinced myself that keeping people at a distance protected me from disappointment. I avoided risks because risks meant change, and change meant facing parts of myself that I had spent too long ignoring. But standing there with Adrian, I realized something unsettling. The person I was most afraid of disappointing had always been myself. We finished our work in near silence and left the office together just before 10. Outside, downtown Seattle glowed beneath strings of holiday lights. The sidewalks were wet from rain, and cold air drifted in from Elliott Bay. Usually, I walked to my apartment alone, listening to music and avoiding unnecessary conversations. That night, Adrian fell into step beside me without either of us mentioning it. We passed crowded restaurants and brightly lit storefronts decorated for Christmas. At one intersection, we stopped to let traffic pass, and Adrian shoved his hands deeper into his coat pockets. You have been quiet, he said. I am thinking. That sounds dangerous. I smiled despite myself. You know, for someone who barely spoke when you started. At Mercer, you have become surprisingly opinionated. Adrian shrugged. Maybe I was waiting for the right person to talk to. The comment should have embarrassed me. Instead, it left me strangely calm. We continued walking until we reached the small park near my apartment building. The city noise faded into the distance, replaced by the sound of wind moving through bare trees. We sat on a bench overlooking the water, and for a few minutes, neither of us said anything. Finally, I looked at him. Can I ask you something? Adrian nodded. Anything. I hesitated, searching for the right words. When did you know? He considered the question. About myself? I nodded. Adrian leaned back against the bench and looked out at the dark water. I think I always knew, even when I was trying to convince myself otherwise. He smiled faintly. Accepting it took longer. I understood that feeling better than I wanted to admit. And your family? I asked. My sister figured it out before I did. He laughed softly. My parents needed time, but they came around eventually. His answer landed heavily in my chest. I thought about my own family, about Emma's quiet support, and all the conversations I had avoided with my parents. For years, I had imagined every possible worst-case scenario. Hearing Adrian talk about his life made those fears seem less certain somehow. What about you? He asked gently. I stared at the lights reflecting off the water. Only Emma knows. Adrian was silent for a moment. That sounds lonely. The simple honesty in his voice caught me off guard. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to insist that I was fine, that I had chosen this life because it was easier. But sitting beside someone who understood exactly what I meant every time I hesitated, lying suddenly felt impossible. It is lonely, I admitted. Adrian did not respond immediately. Instead, he sat there beside me, close enough that I was aware of his presence, but far enough away that nothing felt forced. Eventually, he turned toward me. Mason, you spent so much time worrying about whether people would accept you that you forgot to ask whether you deserved to be accepted in the first place. I frowned. And he smiled, his expression warmer than I had ever seen it. You do. I looked at him beneath the glow of the city lights and realized that, somewhere along the way, the quiet coworker who had once seemed impossible to understand had become the person whose opinion mattered most. And for the first time in years, instead of feeling afraid of what came next, I found myself hoping that whatever happened, I would not have to face it alone. The days after that conversation in the park passed more quietly than I expected. Nothing dramatic changed overnight. Adrian still arrived at the office at exactly 8 o'clock every morning, carrying his dark blue coffee mug. I still stayed too late finishing projects that could have waited until morning. Mercer Media remained filled with endless meetings and holiday decorations that seemed to multiply every week. Yet beneath all those ordinary routines, something fundamental had shifted between us. For the first time since moving to Seattle, I stopped feeling like I was carrying my entire life alone. December settled over the city with cold rain and early sunsets. One Friday afternoon, Emma called while I was organizing files at my desk. Adrian sat across the office, focused on a report, but he glanced up when my phone rang. Hey, I answered. Emma sounded unusually cheerful. Mom wants to know whether you are coming home for Christmas. I smiled. I figured she would ask eventually. Actually, she asked something else too. I leaned back in my chair. Should I be worried? Emma laughed. She wanted to know if there is someone special in Seattle. I instinctively looked toward the glass wall separating my desk from Adrian's office. He was not paying attention anymore, but somehow the question felt different now than it would have a month earlier. And what did you tell her? I asked. Emma hesitated. I told her that maybe she should ask you herself. After we hung up, I sat there staring at my computer screen without seeing any of it. For years, I had treated honesty like a distant possibility, something I would deal with later when life became less complicated. But life never became less complicated. The only thing that changed was how tired I had become of hiding. That evening, Adrian and I left the office together as snow threatened in the distance. We walked our usual route through downtown Seattle, past crowded restaurants and storefronts glowing with Christmas lights. Halfway to my apartment, I stopped walking. Adrian turned toward me immediately. Everything okay? He asked. I slipped my hands into my coat pockets and looked out toward the water. Emma called today. He nodded, waiting. My mother asked whether there was someone important in my life. Adrian smiled faintly. That sounds like a dangerous question. I laughed quietly. It is. We continued walking until we reached the small park where we had sat the week before. The city seemed softer at night, quieter somehow. I sat on the same bench overlooking Elliott Bay, and Adrian joined me. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then, before I could lose my nerve, I looked at him. You know what the strangest part of all this is? He shook his head. For years, I was terrified that someone would figure me out. I smiled to myself. And when it finally happened, it turned out to be the one person who understood exactly what I was trying so hard to hide. Adrian looked down at his hands, clearly searching for the right response. I never wanted you to feel exposed. I know. I took a deep breath. Actually, I think you did the opposite. He frowned slightly. What do you mean? I looked out at the city lights reflected across the water. You made me realize that maybe there was nothing wrong with me in the first place. The words surprised me even as I said them. Adrian was quiet for several seconds before speaking. That took you long enough. I laughed, shaking my head. You really do ruin emotional moments with terrible timing. It is one of my many talents. We sat there talking until the cold finally forced us to stand. Before leaving, Adrian stopped beside the park entrance and glanced back toward the skyline. So what happens now? He asked. A month earlier, the question would have terrified me. I would have searched for excuses, invented reasons to keep my distance, convinced myself that staying hidden was easier. But standing there beside him, I realized that not knowing the future no longer felt frightening. For the first time, it felt hopeful. I smiled and pulled my jacket tighter against the winter air. Honestly, I said, I have no idea. Adrian smiled back. Good. We started walking again, side by side beneath the city lights, and somewhere between the office where we met and the secrets we had both carried for years, I finally understood something that had taken me far too long to learn. Sometimes the people who see us most clearly are not the ones searching for our flaws. Sometimes they are simply waiting for us to stop hiding long enough to be seen.